Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel and to the last in our series on the theme Development Theories of the Gospels are all bunk. Believe it or not, I've been trying to present the more plausible, or perhaps I should say the less implausible, among the theories that you will encounter. There are definitely worse ones out there than the ones that I've surveyed. So I haven't been trying to, scrape the bottom of the barrel here. But these are also some of the more popular ones, the ones that I've talked about in this series. So today, what I'm going to be doing is continuing on the theme of John supposedly indicating hatred of his own people, the Jews. Now, I think there's a very good argument that the author of the fourth gospel is himself Jewish, but that by itself would not necessarily mean that he could not hate the Jews. You do get this kind of weird self-hatred in some ethnic situations where a person, wants to reject his own original identity and forge some other identity instead. So I'm not going to claim by itself that that's a refutation. But I hope to address this in a way that makes it clear. Now, last time I talked about this in terms of Bart Ehrman's idea that in John, the Jews actually crucified Jesus, and that's not true. And in the video before that, I talked about this notion of this gradual development of blaming supposedly the Jews more for Jesus' death and gradually blaming Pilate less for Jesus' death. And I think I've thoroughly refuted those theories. But there remains one other area to be addressed. And this doesn't just focus on the crucifixion, and it doesn't attempt, if a person putting this forward is wise, he will not attempt to argue for a gradual progression. Instead, a person would try to say that it's abrupt. Okay, that you have something in John that just is not present like this at all in the synoptics. So it could still be considered a development theory, but not necessarily that smooth Eohippus sequence development theory where each ancient horse is a little bit bigger than the previous ancient horse. Or in this case, where gradually some kind of hatred of the Jews develops, but rather that it's just really John, okay, which is the latest of the Gospels. And the argument I'm going to address today arises from the much greater use in the fourth gospel of the phrase the Jews. And I mean, it's right there. It's right there in the Greek. In fact, I would encourage you to show that I'm not trying to hide anything here. Get a hold of a more literal translation. Sometimes some of the modern translations, like the most recent version of the NIV, for example, they'll put interpretations into the translation, and they might even be interpretations that I agree with, but it tends to soften the apparent or initial or prima facie effect. So I might agree with the translators that in a certain place it's talking about the Jewish religious leaders, but the phrase in the original isn't, the religious leaders. The phrase in the original is the Jews. So I think it's better in translation to do somewhat less of that interpretation. And if you pick up the Gospels and read them, you will see that the sheer quantity of times that John uses the phrase the Jews is vastly greater than the synoptics. This is really a case where I think we can say there's nothing like it in the synoptics, or virtually nothing like it. You'll hear people say this about the way that Jesus sounds or something, and it's just not true. But when it comes to just the use of this phrase all over the place, it is all over the place in John, and that's just not true in the synoptics. The closest you get is one reference in Matthew in the story of the guard at the tomb, where he says that they agreed to say that the disciples stole the body, and he says that this story is still told among the Jews to this day. So there's a use of the Jews in a context that could be regarded as negative, but even just to use the phrase at all. Generally in the synoptics, the only place you'll really find that phrase is for the title of Jesus in the sign over his head, Jesus, the King of the Jews. Okay, but John uses it for everything. He just uses it a lot. And undeniably, some of these uses are what I think could fairly be called negative. Now, I want to be clear about what I mean. What I mean by a negative use of the phrase the Jews in the fourth gospel is that it's portraying a group of people, it's calling them the Jews, and it's portraying that group negatively. Now, as we discussed last time, that doesn't in and of itself mean that one is saying, hey, you should hate all people who fall under this designation. But these are, in several places, negative uses. In John 8, Jesus has a very adversarial dialogue with a group of people in Jerusalem who are referred to as the Jews. In John 7:1, it says the Jews were seeking to kill him. And in the crucifixion scenes with Pilate, as we'll see, it sometimes refers to the chief priests and the officers of the people. And then other times it will refer to this group as the Jews. And so it'll go back and forth. Pilate said this, the Jews said that. Just like in John 8, Jesus said this, the Jews said that. And it'll go back and forth because it's a dialogue. And it's a dialogue where his opponents are referred to using this phrase. So the question is, does this mean that quite abruptly we see in John, perhaps, as many scholars would say, due to a separation among the Christians between the synagogue and the church in the situation in which the fourth gospel was written, does this mean that they're rejecting their Jewish identity and they're identifying themselves against the Jews, and the Jews are supposed to be bad? Is that what that means? And I'm going to argue no. So I have 4 points to make in this argument. The first point that I want to make is the huge variety of uses that the fourth evangelist John makes of this phrase, the Jews. I think if you read it in a modern translation and you see the different places and you try to look at it fairly and not just get sort of upset by the negative uses, you'll see that the phrase is what I would call ubiquitous, meaning everywhere. It's everywhere. And it's varied. So you'll have these neutral uses where all he's doing is describing customs or festivals. The Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near at hand. Or the water jars were filled for the purification rites of the Jews. There's one passage that's somewhat like that in Mark, where it's talking about the Pharisees and Jesus' disciples not washing, and Mark launches into a little explanation about the hand washing in Jewish culture. So those uses, of course, are just completely neutral and could be viewed as the author thinking of the Gentiles in his audience, and he's going to explain stuff to them, okay? There are also what I call miscellaneous neutral uses. So, for example, when there's a sign written put up over Jesus' head, it says many of the Jews read it, because of the location of Calvary and so forth. I mean, that's not saying anything bad or good. It's just saying many of the Jews read it. Okay. Also, it refers to the mourning of Mary and Martha, and talks about how near their home was to Jerusalem. And so then it says, that many of the Jews came to comfort them. Okay. You could even view that as positive, but it's certainly not negative. There are also uses that are conflicted. The big theme in the Gospel of John that various groups cannot make up their mind what to think about Jesus, or at least some of them have made up their mind one way and others have made up their mind a different way, and that they're arguing, okay, back and forth. In one place, this group is referred to as the multitude. There was a dispute among the multitude, but just in a verse just before that, this is in John 7, it says the Jews were seeking him at the feast and wondering if he would come. And then it says there's a dispute among the multitude about him. Well, is that the same group that it says were wondering if he was going to come to the feast? It could well be. And some of them say he's a good man, and some of them says no, he misleads people. In one place it says there is a division among the Pharisees about him, where some of them are saying, well, if he's bad, how does he open the eyes of the blind? And others are saying, he's bad, right? And then in John 10, it says, now there was again a division among the Jews. And there it actually uses that phrase about him. So I call these conflicted uses. And then there's a very notable positive use, which I'm going to break out for my fourth point by itself. So wait for that. So this great variety and frequency of the use of the phrase, I think, should mean that it doesn't mean hatred. The fact that it is sometimes used for a group that is being portrayed negatively does not mean that the author is seeking to arouse hatred of the Jewish people. And in fact, the very fact that he can even show conflict among the leaders, so that you have Nicodemus, for example, defending Jesus and, almost getting himself in trouble in chapter 7. I think the author probably thinks Nicodemus was a little bit too afraid, too wimpy, and should have owned up that he was following Jesus sooner, but it certainly gives rise to a certain amount of irony that the reader picks up on, because when Nicodemus is defending him to the rest of the leaders, they say, have any among the leaders believed on him? These people are ignorant and they don't know the law. And of course, he is someone among the leaders who is believing on Jesus, but he's just not telling them that. And I think John knows that his readers will pick up on that irony that the speakers there are not aware of. So I don't think he's trying to communicate some general idea, nobody should identify himself as a Jew, Jews are opposed to Christians, we should hate Jews, etc., because of the sheer variety of the uses. The second point I want to make is that many of the negative uses can be definitely identified as referring to the leadership. So that even though the leaders themselves are sometimes conflicted, for the most part within the fourth gospel, the people who are what we might call diehard Jesus haters, okay, are the leaders. And I think that's just very clear. It's almost more of a kind of populism, like that the common people are more open-minded. We see this in our own politics now in the United States, right? That one person appeals more to what you might call the common man, right? And tries to say, my opponents, they're the elite. They're not listening to your concerns. Well, I think John is indicating that really was the situation. There was this snobbery. The leaders were jealous of Jesus' influence. That's mentioned in the synoptics as well. And they thought of themselves as needing to sort of guard religious purity, the Jerusalem elite, okay? And in a lot of these places, certainly in the dialogue with Pontius Pilate, as I mentioned earlier in this video, he refers to the group who's calling out crucify him alternately as the Jews and the chief priests and officers. It's clearly the ones who have held this middle of the night trial for Jesus in chapter 18 and then have dragged him off to Pontius Pilate early in the morning. I think that's definite. And then even in the cases like in chapter 8, where it doesn't say that these are the rulers who are arguing with Jesus, or the sort of the people who regard themselves as more educated and elite. That's certainly open as a possibility. So there's never a place where the negative use is supposed to apply to like everybody, even at the time. It's applying to subsets of the Jews, even of Jesus' own place and time. All right, third point. Everybody involved in these conflicts between Jesus and his disciples on the one side and his opponents on the other side is a Jew. I'm not including Pilate here, but what I mean is when there's a conflict and Jesus is standing there and he's arguing, like in chapter 10 or in chapter 8, everybody in the conversation is a Jew. Jesus is quoting the Old Testament. The author cannot possibly expect us to miss that or expect his early audience to be unaware of that. Jesus faithfully keeps the festivals, the overarching context of the book is heavily Jewish. It is a heavily Jewish context. He is the Messiah. He is coming as the Messiah. He is the one who has been foretold. He's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. The people come out bearing palm branches and shouting, Hosanna to the Son of David. The rulers are upset because everybody is going after him. At least that's how the rulers view it. They even say, this isn't working. The people are all following him. So this pervasively Jewish context, again, shows that this really can't be an expression of hatred toward the Jews as a people, even when the author in narrating uses the term for a negatively portrayed group. It's got to be a subset. In fact, it almost gives rise to something that's a little bit unintentionally humorous that makes you wonder. It makes me curious how to interpret this. In the chapter where Jesus is called to go and heal Lazarus. Lazarus is sick, and he's thinking of going back. His disciples speak up and they argue with him, and they say, when you were last in Jerusalem, the Jews tried to stone you. Well, his disciples are Jews, and he's a Jew. Now you could say, well, that, historically maybe the disciples didn't actually use that phrase. That could even be a very moderate, trivial paraphrase. But what does the author even expect his readers to think there? Certainly he doesn't expect his readers to think that the disciples who are arguing with Jesus are not Jews themselves. And this gives rise to the possibility that the term could possibly be used to mean those who dwell in Jerusalem. The Southerners, you might say, because several of Jesus' disciples were from Galilee. And I've often spoken of this Galilee-centric view that you sometimes get in the Gospels. So maybe they did refer to them that way. And there's one time where Jesus says to his disciples, as I said to the Jews, so I say to you, that where I am, you cannot follow. So apparently it looks like the author intends us to think that even in the original context, they could at least speak to one another that way and understand one another. So, this pervasively Jewish context, that's the third point. It expresses a pro-attitude, a positive attitude towards Jesus' own Jewish origins. All right, and finally, I think very, very important, there's only one place that I've been able to find in the entire gospel where that phrase, the Jews, is used to make some really broad sweeping comment about the nation as a whole. And that's John 4:22. And it's in the mouth of Jesus. He's speaking to the woman at the well, who's a Samaritan. And he says, we know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Some translations give it, salvation is from the Jews. Okay? So he's making a generalization there, and that is very positive toward the Jews. He's giving her, not harshly, but still the information that, hey, we were God's chosen people first. Salvation comes from us to the rest of the world. Salvation is from the Jews. Very important, very positive declaration, and it's the one place in the gospel where it's this very, very broad sweeping comment about the Jews as a whole nation. In fact, I'm not going to say that the Apostle Paul had necessarily heard that story, though he might have. He might have heard about Jesus talking with the woman at the well, even if the Gospel of John had not been written down yet. But what I do want to say is there's a theme in the writings of Paul, especially in the book of Romans, that could be viewed as like an extended commentary on that verse, on that one saying of Jesus, salvation is of the Jews. And think about those middle chapters in Romans, if you've ever read them. Romans 9 and following, Paul has this analogy to the vine, and you have the domesticated vine, which represents the Jewish nation, and then some of the branches have been cut off due to disobedience, and then you have the wild vine branches, which he uses to represent the Gentiles, which have been grafted in. And then he very solemnly warns his Gentile readers, don't boast against the vine. And you may say, they were cut off that we might be grafted in. And he says, but if you were able to be grafted in as a wild vine, God is all the more able to graft the domestic branches back on. And so all Israel shall be saved. The calling and election of God are eternal. They're forever. Okay, and so he's very clear. Salvation is of the Jews. God chose them first, and then from them the message went forth. And this, of course, is true to those of us who are Christians. That's where it began, with Jesus and his disciples and the Jerusalem church and so forth. In fact, this theme is actually picked up elsewhere in the book of Romans, where Paul's talking about the money that he's collecting from the churches of Asia Minor and Macedonia and Greece, and is going to take to Jerusalem. And he says specifically that as the Gentiles have been sharers in the spiritual things from the Jews, so the Gentiles ought to share with them in temporal things. So it's like a sign of love between Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, and a thank offering that the Gentile Christians from these mostly Gentile churches are gathering together to send to the mother church, as you might call it, at Jerusalem. So once again, this Pauline theme, salvation is of the Jews, spelled out at much greater length, fits beautifully with that one saying of Jesus in John 4:22 to the woman at the well. So, summary, saying that John's use of the phrase the Jews indicates hatred of the Jewish nation is anachronistic, and it fails to take account of the whole context of the whole book and the many different uses within the book. I think with that, I'm ready to move on from the theme of development sequences, or alleged development sequences in the Gospels, and I'm thinking I might start talking about the other apostles among the 12 in the book of Acts. And sometimes you get this implication that they kind of drop off the map and that we don't really know if any of them apostatized in the book of Acts, and how do we really know that they were telling the story of Jesus and sticking by the story that Jesus was risen from the dead. I was asked that question by a correspondent some weeks back, and so I think I might delve into that in my next few presentations. I hope you'll come back to the Lydia Migru channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.